Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Teaching Sex Ed. And today we'll be discussing facilitation skills with Dr. Nadine Thornhill. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box that is located in the bottom center of your screen. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical questions. And Dr. Nadine Thornhill will be taking questions throughout the presentation. So if you have something that's relevant to what she's talking about, please feel free to enter those questions at any time. My name is Savannah Holt. I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that's located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our organizational focus is to reduce disabling conditions in children using primary prevention methods. We raise awareness by providing trainings, information, and resources based on current best evidence. We believe that all children have, regardless of their ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, maternal and infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, child traffic safety, parenting, and sexual and reproductive health. One focus of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program is to provide evidence-based information on sexual and reproductive health that is accessible to health educators and to the youth that they work with. Saskatchewan youth have high rates of sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancy. Providing comprehensive, sex-positive, and preventive sexual health education helps youth build the skills, confidence, and attitudes they need to make healthier choices. However, for a variety of reasons, many teachers and educators might not feel comfortable or confident in delivering sex education in their classrooms. So today we're here to talk about facilitation skills that can help you confidently deliver sex education. And to help us do that, as I've mentioned, is Dr. Nadine Thornhill. Nadine Thornhill is a sexuality educator, speaker, and content creator based in Toronto, Ontario. She's helped thousands of adults and youth learn and speak openly about consent, pleasure, relationships, and sexuality. Nadine created #SaveSexEd, a YouTube series covering every sex education module in Ontario's 2015 Health and Physical Education curriculum. She's also a writer and co-host of the acclaimed web series, Everybody Curious. Welcome, Nadine.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really great to be back virtually.
We're so happy to have you.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to be working with you today. And so I'm going to share my screen in just a moment. Just want to give folks a heads up. My son, who is at school, has been texting me today because he's working on a project. He knows that I am in a workshop right now, but if you hear a text alert coming over my computer, that is probably who that is, just to let you know. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Share. And let me move that over. All right. All right, so could folks just let me know in the chat, do you see a slide right now that says sex ed facilitation skills? Yes, fabulous. All right, then we are on track. So welcome everyone to sex ed facilitation skills. So what we're going to cover after a brief intro is we're going to talk a little bit about some pre-class prep. We're going to talk about how to create a class container, how to question box. Question box is one of my favorite tools to use in sex ed workshops and classes. We're going to talk a little bit about exercises and how to incorporate those into a sex ed lesson, group discussions, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. I will also be taking a pause after each segment of the workshop to answer any questions that you may have sort of ongoing. So I know Savannah's here to moderate the questions, so feel free to pop those in the chat at any time. We'll be taking a few breaks and I'll be answering questions throughout. in addition to at the end of the workshop. So before I dive into all of this information, which hopefully will be juicy and helpful and fun, I would like to tell you a little bit about me and how I approach my work, and also just, my lived experience and the identities that inform how I do my work as a sex educator. So I am a Black, queer, neurodivergent, cisgender woman. For folks who may not be familiar with the term cis, that means that I was assigned a gender at birth, which was female, and I identify with that gender. I am a settler, and more specifically, I am the child of immigrants from Bermuda and Barbados. So I am first generation Canadian. There's that chime. I am also descended from slaves, from Caribbean slaves. I do enjoy economic privilege. I have body privilege as a reasonably thin person and also an able-bodied person. I enjoy the privilege of citizenship. And I also enjoy privilege as someone who is queer but is straight presenting because of my relationship situation. I approach my work from what I describe as a sex positive or sex neutral framework. And to try and summarize that really quickly, that basically means that I see sexuality as an inherent and very natural part of the human condition. My hope is that as a sexuality educator, I can provide information that will help folks experience their sexuality, relate to their own sexuality, and relate to others in ways that are pleasurable and that are positive. I also acknowledge that that has not been the case for everybody, and that I don't see sex as necessarily an inherently good or bad thing, but just an inherently human thing. I try to be queer inclusive in my work. And present my work and present information in ways that include queer experiences, queer bodies, and the specific needs of queer folk. I tend to prioritize lived experience over things like academic information, which is not to say that I don't see value in academic information, in research. But however, I believe that a person's lived experience, their feelings, what they've been through, and their perspective is ultimately what is most important to me when I'm doing my work. I am pro-choice. I am pro-choice sort of in the more traditional sense, in that I believe in people's right to make choices around their reproductive health, and also around family planning and around pregnancy. But I am also pro-choice in a broader sense, in that I try to give people information, but I very rarely will say to people, this is the choice you need to make, or this is the best choice for you. I really try to leave it to people to take whatever information I can offer them, and use that in whatever way they feel will work best for their lives. I am pro-consent. I want people to participate and engage with other people with information in whatever they do, because that is what they choose to do, because that is what works for them, and that is because that is what they want to do. And I am pro pleasure. I am very much on board with folks having a good time. I like to have a good time. I like to feel good. I hope you all have a good time, and this is an enjoyable workshop for you. So those are some of my biases, my perspectives, and my values as a sex educator and just as a human. And before we dive in, does anybody have any questions about me, about anything that I've said so far? Always happy to answer those questions.
Hi, we have one question. Someone is wondering, could you clarify how you differentiate sex positive from sex neutral? They think they might have missed a bit of that definition.
Yeah, no problem. So sex positive and sex neutral are terms that people often use interchangeably. And basically, it's sort of an approach to sexuality that I would say sort of prioritizes people's right to have positive sexual experiences and have positive feelings about their own sexuality. But some people prefer the term sex neutral because they feel that the term sex positive sometimes has this connotation that everybody needs to like want to have sex and everybody needs to like sex, and sex is always a good experience for people. And we know that that's not true. There are people who, don't want to have sex with a partner or anybody else. There are definitely people who have had sexual experiences that have been negative. And we don't want to, discount or make those people or their experiences invisible. And some people just feel like sex neutral sort of captures the idea that, well, sex is just part of humanity. It's neither good nor bad. So you may see people using those terms interchangeably, which is why I used both. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat. What is your education background?
Oh, okay. So interesting. My undergraduate degree is actually in theater. I began my career as an actor and a playwright when I was a child, and I thought that's what I would be doing for the rest of my life, and fell into sex education like completely by accident. And so once I decided that I wanted to switch careers and become a sexuality educator, then I did my graduate studies in human sexuality, and I have a doctorate of education with a focus on child and adolescent sexuality, and specifically my research project was on family-based sex education.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you for asking those questions. All right, so we're going to dive in, and I'm going to be doing sort of a combination of just talking and handing you information, but there are going to be times when I may prompt you to share your perspective or participate in a couple of activities that would be similar to what I might do in a classroom and what you might do in a classroom if you're teaching sex ed. And so the first thing I want to talk about, though, is a little bit of pre-class prep. And that's really about sort of getting ourselves ready and putting ourselves in a frame of mind to share information about sexuality with our students, regardless of their age or which grade they are teaching. Actually, I'm just going to ask people before we start in the chat, if you just want to let me know whether you have, I'm just curious, like, have you taught sex ed before? You can just let me know yes or no. No, no, yes, yes, no, no, yes, no. Okay, so we've got a mix of yeses or nos. That's fantastic. Soon, just starting to folks with intellectual disabilities, to adults with developmental delays at the University of Okay, so we've got like a lot, like I've got a range of experience. And so some of you have already said, but for other folks, I'm just curious what like age group or grade or demographic that you teach. Adults, teens, youth, adolescents, junior, senior high, middle school, grades 6 and 7, university, teens, adults, youth 12 plus. Okay, that's fantastic. So I'm seeing a lot of like elementary, like sort of, oh, I see elementary, high school, college, special needs. So we've got some folks who are teaching all sorts of groups, all sorts of grades. Some of you are teaching a very specific age group or a specific demographic. All right. Fantastic. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, we can extrapolate and use for groups, different age ranges, different folks. There are a couple of things, specifically question box. Question box I usually use for I definitely use it with youth, but I don't use it for very young kids. So I don't use it for preschoolers or for youth in primary grades, but anyone else, we can do question box. And I see that some folks are working with people with either like developmental delays or disabilities. So I will talk a little bit about ways to modify question box, depending on the groups we're talking about, but we're not there yet. Okay, so pre-class prep. Teaching sex ed can be really great. It can also be challenging sometimes. So some of the reasons that it can be challenging, particularly if if you're someone who's never done it before, it can be a little bit intimidating. You may be nervous. A lot of us have grown up in, either in households or social situations where we may not be used to speaking really frankly about sexuality. If you're, teaching in front of a group that you've never taught with before, you may not know what the group dynamics are going to be. So those are all, those are some reasons that teaching sex ed can be challenging. Okay. So I will ask you, why is it important as teachers, as facilitators, as group leaders to treat ourselves with care and compassion? And I think this is important generally always because we're humans, but specifically when we are approaching, when we're getting ready for our teaching, our job as sex educators, because we are human too. So we can treat students with compassion. You can't treat other people with necessary care and compassion if you don't first extend it to yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. It's good modeling because we are our biggest critics, because it is hard and it involves being vulnerable. Yep. So we can be happy and, oh, the answers are coming in hot. I love this. We can't expect to know all the answers to all and you can't, we're always learning. We don't know everything. We're humans helping humans. We are still learning too. I am recognizing our own experience and responses. Yeah, I am loving all of these answers, and all of these answers are bang, bang on. We're humans. We need the care and compassion. If we're not treating ourselves with care and compassion, we can't extend that to our students. It's self-preservation. It's great modeling. I think also with sexuality, because it can be a fraught topic, some of us may have trauma around sexuality, and we may need to be, very careful with how we approach the topic. It might bring up feelings about our own experiences we hadn't realized or dealt with. Exactly. So I think going in to, whatever situation we're going into as sex ed teachers, we first need to remember to, to take care of ourselves, to be gentle with ourselves, and to give ourselves that permission to be, not only teachers and facilitators, but to learn alongside of our students, to also be curious, to give ourselves that grace to, maybe sometimes make mistakes, to not have all the answers, and to have feelings and emotions. We need to recognize and respect our own boundaries when teaching and talking about personal and sometimes traumatic topics. Yeah, absolutely. So that's just something I encourage folks to keep in mind when you're going to be teaching sex ed or any topic that may feel challenging or fraught or sensitive or intimidating, and to think about, what is it that you need that will help you when you are facilitating, whether that's thinking about, what is the structure of the lesson and what is going to make this lesson more enjoyable? What are aids and resources that I can use that may make some of this easier for me? Whether that's, deciding that I'm going to kick things off by showing this great video that I know instead of trying to dive in and, speak off the cuff if it's your first time, or getting a great collection of books, or connecting with other folks in the community or people who might come in and sort of help you in facilitation. You may know somebody who's a fantastic educator with the agency. I mean, we're all connected here with Savannah and the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, so reaching out to, maybe other organizations and being like, do you have a speaker? Or, do you know someone who comes into classrooms who can help me out with that? Co-teaching, all of these things that may make it easier. Thinking about, how am I going to divide up the lesson? Do I want to try and tackle this all in one day, or do I want to give us like a week to really settle in? These are all questions that you can sort of consider and think about. Yeah, How can you be kind to yourself as a facilitator? And you can also do things like, do I need to have water while I'm teaching? I do. Do I need snacks? Am I going to build in breaks? All of those sorts of things. So another question is, what are ways that we might deal with uncomfortable emotions that may come up for us? So some of you have already mentioned that, yeah, things may come up, and if we know we have emotional triggers or things that are difficult, it's great to sort of try to think ahead and plan for those. But sometimes a student or someone in one of our classes or our workshops may say something or bring something up that we weren't prepared for, and it just gets us in our feelings. And so when that happens, what are some things that we might do? Pause and take a breath. Yep, love that. Deep breaths, write it down, be honest about what's happening for us. Breathing, build in time for stress reducing, stress reducing, a video break, seek out support or peer support, professional support, debrief, allow ourselves space to sit with those uncomfortable emotions as opposed to pushing them away. Ask for some time to come back to the question, absolutely. Before class, talk about how things may become uncomfortable for any of us and that that's okay. Admit when you're not okay. Yep. Doing the work to address your own triggers. Be transparent if appropriate to do so with youth. Love that. Yeah. Yeah, these are all, again, fantastic. You are all on the ball with this. And now I'm like, why am I here? You all are amazing. But hopefully I have some things that I can still share with you and that will be valuable. But yeah, these are all fantastic, fantastic suggestions. So self-regulating, so doing things like, taking a deep breath or a few deep breaths if you feel yourself becoming dysregulated. And something that I've started doing is I do, I know it's a little bit cliche, but I do about 10 minutes of meditation every morning, just because I really want to build that habit of remembering that I can access that sort of deep breathing when I need to. And because it's now becoming a habit, it's easier to remember to do that in situations that are high stress. So even just, maybe building a breathing practice or like a really simple meditation practice can be a helpful sort of long-term way of being able to more easily access that when you are in a situation that feels emotionally fraught. Love the suggestions to actually acknowledge that you're having a difficult time. And y'all are right, as long as your audience is emotionally capable of understanding that, which I find you can do even with fairly young kids. You can say, oh, wow, that was a big question. And I'm really glad you asked that, but I'm just gonna need a minute because I'm not sure how to answer that. So I'm going to take a deep breath, and you can even invite the class to do it with you, or invite the group to do it with you. If you want to, you can take a deep breath with me, or we can take 3 deep breaths together. And I'm going to take a little while to think about that. And I'm going to come back and answer that question when I'm ready, because that question deserves a good answer. That is absolutely something we can do. Also, I really love the suggestions to debrief. And I understand that depending on where it is and when you are delivering sex ed, for example, if you're in a classroom and you're like, wow, it's the beginning of period and I'm not going to be able to step out until the end of period, doing some of those on the spot self-regulation exercises can be helpful. But then, yeah, finding another teacher, or maybe even it's a friend or someone in your life outside the school, and saying like, wow, okay, I just had this experience, it really hit me, I just need to kind of talk it through. That's fantastic. Also, you can build in some debrief. If you can build in some debrief time, if you know that you are someone who has some emotional triggers, or it doesn't even have to be triggers. If you just know that sometimes I get anxious, and sometimes, facilitating takes a lot out of me. If you're able to find ways to build in just decompression time, quiet time, self-rejuvenation time afterwards, that can be really helpful as well. Connecting with other educators, other facilitators, talking through the experience, all of those things can be super helpful. And so a few other tips before we begin, or before you begin or walk into a class. When you are planning your sex ed lesson, flexible planning can make things a little easier. And so when I am planning out a workshop or a lesson with students, or with anybody, even when I was doing this today, I have a general outline for what I want to do and how I would like things to flow. But I do give myself permission to sort of switch things up, to change gears, to drop things, to stay on a certain activity or a certain discussion if I get into the group and I find that I'm like, oh, okay, well, we were going to have a class on consent, and we really got mired today in discussing some of the emotions that come up when we feel rejection. And even if that's not what I had planned, I will allow myself and allow my group to stay with that topic if that seems to be something that really resonates. Or if I have an activity and I was really excited about it, and then I find like this activity is not landing with this group, give us permission to kind of move on and do something else. Another thing is to consider how you can invalidate students' emotional and lived experiences around sexuality. And, I really try to prepare myself to, whatever they throw at me, to be like, you know what, it's okay that you feel like that. It's okay that you think that. I acknowledge that this is maybe a thing that has happened to you, or a thing that you've observed, or a thing that you've learned. Because that can really help a group to open up and to feel safe. So you may have a great lesson planned, and you may breeze through it, and folks may ask you questions, and you may not have all the answers, and that's okay, because you can learn. And I don't know that I have ever gone through a lesson and had been able to like answer every question without like just off the top of my head. And so when you don't know the answer to something, it's a great opportunity to learn, depending on, again, the situation. You may take some time to learn together as a group. Sometimes you may have to go away and do some studying and like vet some resources, and then come back later and say, okay, well, thank you for asking me that question, because now I have an answer for you, and this is what it is. You will likely make mistakes. If you teach sex ed long enough, I will actually virtually guarantee that you will make mistakes. And a lot of mistakes will be small. I can almost guarantee you I will make some mistake at some point during this workshop if I haven't already. But sometimes the mistakes are bigger, and sometimes inadvertently we make mistakes and we cause harm. And when that happens, we can take responsibility. You can take responsibility. We can apologize. We can make amends if that's something that the other person needs. It doesn't mean that you're terrible or awful. It just means that we're human, and yeah, sometimes we mess up. And again, you cannot do this perfectly. There is no such thing as a perfect sex educator, or a perfect sex ed class, or a perfect sex ed workshop, but you can get better over time. And if you do this repeatedly, you will get better over time. And I'm just going to take a pause. Are there any questions or comments in the chat?
Yeah, we do. So someone mentioned in the chat that they never know what is best to do when a student discloses uncomfortable information in front of others, more than what they would do, more than what to do for myself. Any ideas how to respond to those disclosures?
Okay, yeah. So it depends. So definitely if a student is disclosing, actually, sorry, let me backtrack there. So if a student has disclosed information that you feel is maybe a little like sort of intense, or it may be, just a too much information situation for the class. Something that you can say is something along the lines of, you know what, I'm really happy that you felt comfortable to bring that up. Some folks here may not be ready to talk about that in the group, but I would love to talk to you about that, and you can say, after class or at the break, if you want to talk about this more, because I think this is really important. If a student has disclosed something that is not only maybe uncomfortable or a little too much for the class, but they've disclosed something, for example, like a situation where they're undergoing abuse, that then there's a whole nother element to it. And and how you respond is definitely going to depend on, say, for example, how old the student is, how much they're able to comprehend. But again, that's a situation where I would try to really encourage them to come talk to me privately. I would probably say after the entire session is done, because you can't address something like that, say, in a 10-minute break. And sometimes there are laws around disclosures and having to report. You may be someone who has a duty to report. I have a lot of complicated feelings and beliefs around that, because depending on who the child is, depending on their identity, sometimes getting caught up in a system can be really, really fraught. So I think, yeah, talking to them, trying to get clarification from them about what it is that is exactly going on. If the student is older, and particularly if they're a teenager, I am usually fairly honest about the fact that I have a duty to report, and that if they tell me that they're experiencing harm, that legally I have to report it to authorities. I tell them that because if they just need to talk to me or talk to somebody, I want them to do that consensually. And I want them to have as much agency as possible in that situation. And so if they do not want that reported, I want them to know that. And this is a workaround that I feel comfortable using. It's not something that everybody feels comfortable using. So I will let everybody make their own choice around this. What I will often say to someone who is a teenager, and if I perceive that they understand the consequences, I will say, like, if I know this is something that's happening to you, I need to report. If it's just something you're telling me hypothetically, I don't have to report it. Do you need to, like, is there something you want to talk to me about? Because in a lot of cases, sometimes I feel like it's really important sometimes for people just to be able to have somebody safe to talk to, and to get something out. And I would rather they at least say something than feel like I can't ever tell anybody, because I don't want to get taken away from my parents, or I don't want CAS involved. I don't want other people to know. But like I said, that's very much a judgment call. And follow-ups. And I see some other folks here are also have some suggestions in the chat, which is great.
A follow-up question, is it worth prefacing a lesson with information like that? Or do you think it would deter students or learners from disclosing?
I think it depends on what the topic is. So for example, in a consent workshop, and say if I was doing a consent workshop with like tweens or teens, oftentimes I will sort of very quickly let them know that, and sort of let them know up front that, we're going to be discussing consent. Sometimes that can bring up difficult feelings for people. I sort of have a whole preamble that I do where I also encourage them just to be sensitive to the fact that some people may have experienced consent violations and whatnot. And I will say that, yeah, as an adult, and because of their age, I do have a duty to report if anybody tells me about things that are happening to them, but that I do not have to report if they tell me about things that have happened to other people. And when we get into question box, which is very shortly, question box is also another opportunity for people to disclose if they need to, actually. I will say in the 15 years I've been doing this, I have very rarely had disclosures in a question box format, but it has happened once or twice. And as you'll see, question box is anonymous. So I don't know. I don't know who's, who's disclosed, but then it's usually they have a question that they want to ask around some sort of experience that they've had, maybe related to their abuse, and they just really want an answer to that question. And in which case I will just answer the question. Awesome. Are there any questions before we move on?
Yeah, I think, well, we have so many questions. Maybe we'll do one more. I can save some.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So someone had a question about cultural considerations when educating and presenting to Indigenous people, noting that First Nation students can become very uncomfortable. Do you have any way to address this?
So cultural competency is really difficult, and it's really complex. And my approach has often been that if I know that I have students or participants in my group who have specific needs around, their cultural or their any aspect of their identity that it sort of informs how they move through the world, as much as possible, I try, and whenever possible, I actually try to bring in other educators who share that identity and, again, who have that lived experience. So, for example, working with Indigenous youth is something that I never do on my own. Like, I will only consider doing it if I have, at the very least, a co-presenter who is Indigenous and is representative of the nation that has asked me to come in. Yeah, it's tricky because I don't really have any sort of quick tips on how to suddenly increase your cultural competency beyond things that I think are sort of trite sounding. Absolutely, I think if that's not an option, then finding as many resources as possible that have been created by people who also share that identity is really helpful. I think if you can't bring somebody else in, finding ways to consult with groups and organizations in that community is going to be helpful. I think it's super important in that case to very much acknowledge that you have a specific lens based on your own identity, and that you are not necessarily going to be able to address, and you may not be aware and likely will not be aware of all of the specific needs of those students or those participants. And then finally, what I think my last suggestion is, if you have to be that person in the room, if there's nobody else available and it has to be you, to as much as possible defer to the expertise and the lived experience of your participants. So that's where I would, even more so than usual, look at, a lot of open-ended questions, a lot of opportunity for your participants to talk, as opposed to you sort of talking and giving them information. Like questions, curiosity. Like you're going to be in a situation where you're learning as much, if not more, than your participants. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to navigate. And I'm sorry, I wish I had a more comprehensive answer than that. And I understand that depending on where you're teaching, it may not always, you may not have a choice. If you're in a school and you're the teacher and sex ed is part of your curriculum and the majority of your students are Indigenous and you're not, you may not be able to bring in an entirely different teacher. Because I work independently, I am someone who is able to say, listen, I am not the right person to facilitate with this group because I don't have enough lived experience and cultural competency here. So I think whenever it's possible, do that. Be like, I can't. And then if you have to, yeah, just pull as much information and pull as much support as possible from the community that you're serving.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
No problem. All
I have
right.
one more thing to note. Just it was asked early on, but if you can provide tips for how you would talk about different topics or share these strategies online, I think that might be very helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely, sure. And as we get into, so a lot of what I said you can absolutely do in an online context, in an online group. So, even things like, okay, I need to take a deep breath because I got a question that threw me off. What I've found now that I've been doing this online a lot in the last year is there's maybe just a little bit more need to sort of narrate what you're doing. So, for example, if I need to take a deep breath when I'm in the room with someone, it's a little bit more obvious that I'm doing that because you can physically see my entire body. Whereas, if I was to do that here, actually, I will demonstrate. I'm about to take a deep breath. Join me if you would like to. So, I tend to narrate what I'm doing a little bit more. I tend to be a little bit more, I think, expressive with my hands, again, because I can't use my whole body. My lower body is pretty static right now. And then there are sort of housekeeping technical things you need to navigate, like deciding whether, our mic's going to be on or off. How are people going to, ask questions, or how are they going to share their thoughts? Are they going to go into a chat box? Are you, there are also tools that you can use, like there are tools like Kahoot and Mentimeter, and even there's G Slides, which is interactive, which will allow people to sort of type and share answers, and you can display those answers. So yeah, so the information is the same, but you may need to look at using sort of different tools, visual aids, etc. So let's talk about creating the class container. So basically, a class container, sometimes this is known as like creating safer space, or coming up with sort of a list of just, group agreements to really help facilitate conversation and sharing, and doing what we can to kind of make the experience as pleasant and as comfortable for people as possible. And so usually in groups, what I will do is I will ask folks what it is they need in order to feel comfortable sharing, in order to feel comfortable talking. And so this is an example of some of the group rules or guidelines that have come up in a lot of the workshops and a lot of the classes that I've done. Yours may look different. You may start with sort of a preliminary set of like, here are 3 things that I, as the facilitator, need, and have people add to them. So these are just examples. You may have different ones. So we remember that all bodies are good bodies. There's no good or bad bodies. There's just different bodies. Saying some, many, most. So when we're talking about sexuality, again, because it's such a vulnerable thing for people, instead of saying like, oh, well, everyone does this, or no one feels this way, we say, well, some people feel this way. Many people experience this. Most people may have this bit of anatomy. We call people by the names and the pronouns that they want us to use. And I apologize. I should have my pronouns in my name, and I don't know why they're not there. My pronouns are she and her. I didn't say that because I thought it was written down and it wasn't. My apologies. Step up, step back. Step up, step back is basically if you have something you want to share, if you want to answer a question, step up, answer the question, but also be conscious of the fact that other people may have things they want to share, other things they want to say. Step back. Also, it is okay if something comes up and you just want to listen and learn, and you don't really want to talk about it. You can step back. We say, don't laugh at people's thoughts, bodies, or experiences. Another way I will frame this, particularly with younger kids, is I will say, you can laugh at anything that I say as the teacher or the facilitator. but when our classmates and our peers are sharing, let's not laugh, because we never know what might be sensitive for somebody. But I do like to give them like some space and permission to laugh, because again, sometimes we laugh when we're uncomfortable, or we're like talking about like balls or something, and it's just funny to them. And so I'm like, yeah, like I want to give them space to kind of get that out, but just make sure they're not laughing at somebody else who may feel badly about that. We talk about sharing our own thoughts and experiences. So, it's not fair to talk about other people or their experiences or thoughts if they haven't given us permission, but we can always talk about ourselves if we want to, and we want to share about that. And that leads to do not share other people's thoughts or experiences without their permission. And if we hurt someone's feelings, we can apologize. So those are some things that I would put in a safe space container. And I see the chat count going up. Are there questions about this?
There is one question. Can I please ask for you to, for a specific verbiage, read when I, as the facilitator, can get a question that I'm not the right person to speak to, at least fully. So for example, if I'm a POC, but not Indigenous, but the question or asker is Indigenous, and they sort of created a prompt in quotation marks, sorry, I don't have enough lived experience and blank. So how might you respond to something where you don't think that you have the lived experience to address it?
Sure, okay. And again, we might modify this depending on whether we're talking to an adult or a child. But actually, I think the way that you said it was really good. So yeah, I would say something like, you know what, that's a really great question. And because I'm not Indigenous and I've never had that experience, I actually don't know the answer to that. And then if you actually have the capacity to do it as a follow-up, or if I had the capacity to do it as a follow-up, I might say, you know what? I do know a few people who are Indigenous. So if it's okay with you, I would love to check in with them and see what they say about that. And then if you like, I can come back to you and let you know what their answer was. Would that be okay for you? That's something that I would say. Is that helpful?
I think so.
The name game, awesome. Oh, okay, somebody like previewed something I'm gonna do in a little while. I love it. So just a few things to remember also when we're creating our container or our safe space. So if you're working with younger students or younger people, they may not always have the capacity to articulate their emotional needs. So I'm going to tell hopefully a super quick story. So recently there's been discussion in the media around Dr. Seuss and the fact that his estate has chosen to cease publication on a few texts or a few books they had that had some really aggressively problematic racist imagery. And a discussion I've heard a lot around this is, well, maybe it would be valuable to still have these books available because we could sort of, have them in schools and teach students and have conversations around why, these depictions of Black folks are problematic. And so a conversation that I had with someone recently was that the reason that makes me nervous and uncomfortable is because, I'm old enough that I remember that when I was a student, occasionally we would have books in my school that would have these racist images in them. And that when I was a very young student, I was like, it very much affected me and sort of provoked these very complex, weird feelings of shame that I was too young to articulate. And so my concern around that, and the thing I always want, teachers and educators to be aware of, particularly working with younger students, is that a student may or may not speak up around this. They may not say anything. And again, particularly if you don't share their identity or that experience, you may have no idea about how it might affect them if they aren't able to articulate it, and particularly if they're younger, or even if they have developmental delays or they have verbal challenges. A student may be feeling something, but they may not be able to say it to you. So it's just something to be aware of. And then for students of any age with marginalized identities, it may not feel safe asking for what they need. And of course, none of us are mind readers, but again, and already we've had a lot of great questions around that. So I'm really glad that people are asking about this and thinking about it. Just, again, being aware that there may be students or participants in your sex ed classes and workshops who have needs that they are not expressing. And so as a general rule, I think that it can be helpful to just assume that your group includes or will include racialized students, queer students, students with disabilities, students who have been or are being abused, neurodivergent students, and students with mental health challenges. And just on the note of neurodivergent students and students with disabilities, just a reminder that some people may have disabilities or who may be neurodivergent in ways that are not apparent. And something I did not disclose about myself, and I don't know why I wasn't on that first list of bullet points. I myself am neurodivergent. I have ADHD, and I also have mental health challenges. And so it's not something that's always apparent to people. It isn't always something that I need accommodated, but sometimes I do. But if you sort of walk in with those assumptions, it can help to sometimes mitigate, or it can help you sort of start thinking through like what might be some of the needs and or challenges of people in the group. And like I said earlier, we will never do it perfectly, but by being open to it and by doing our best and by being willing to learn to receive, constructive criticism and correction, we can get better and better at it. All right. Any questions before we move on to the question box?
I think we're caught up.
Yay, okay. Okay, so the question box. The question box gives students or participants an opportunity to ask any questions they have about sexuality anonymously. Okay, so how we can do a question, I'm just going to talk really quickly about how to do a question box digitally, and then I will go through my slides, which is doing a question box IRL. So a digital question box, you can do a few things. You can say, for example, Google, if you have like the Google suite with like, Google Drive and Google Docs and whatever, there's also Google Forms. And what you can do is you can just set up a form where it's just, ask me a question. Ask me any question you want about sexuality. I believe you can set up a Google form such that people can just submit the question anonymously. And you can either sort of, give people the link and give them a window of time to submit questions. And then you have all the questions and it's super easy. I tend to use Google Forms, or sometimes if I am, say, on Zoom or a similar platform, I will just instruct people to send me their question in the chat, and I will explain how they can, you can in the chat function share with everyone, but then you can always toggle and look at the participants, and then you can just send the question to the host. And what I will often have people do in that case is just change your username to like anonymous, or change it to not your name, and then I don't know who it's coming from. So those are ways you can do question box sort of digitally. But my favorite is like live in-person question box. Also, doing question box digitally is like a really good option if you have people, for example, who have like mobility issues and they can't physically write. A digital question box, something like a form, can also often be more accessible because people have the opportunity to do voice to text. What you need to do in that situation, though, is you need to find a way for everyone to sort of be separate so nobody overhears them like articulating the question. Okay, so the question box setup, if I was doing this IRL and everybody was writing a question, what I do is I give everyone the same size and the same color paper. I usually like to use just cue cards. I have some here, like this, but I make sure everybody gets the same color and the same size. I also give everyone the exact same type of writing implement. So I have my own special pens and pencils for question box. So like if it's purple pens, everybody's getting the purple pen. And whenever possible, I will have the students or the participants spread out from one another so everybody has their own private space. And I have everybody write their questions at the same time. So whenever possible, I will have dedicated question box time. The reason that I do this is because as much as possible, I don't want anybody to be able to identify anyone's question. So like if I open up the paper, nobody can say like, oh, well, I saw that like Levon had like yellow paper and a red pen, and I see like red writing on yellow paper. So I know that that was his question. That's why I do that. And also, you know, having them write their questions at the same time means that, you know, it's not that, you know, I'm teaching and then suddenly he's like, oh, I have a question, let me write it down. And everybody stares at them and he's like, oh, now we're watching you because we know you have a question about sex. It's just to try and make it like, just to generalize the experience. So what I also do is I will provide an alternate prompt for students or participants who don't want to ask a question. Because again, I don't want it to be a situation where, oh, there are only actually 3 people who have questions and now they feel really self-conscious because they're the only people writing. And my prompts are really basic. I'm usually like, you know, recommend a show that I should watch on Netflix. Like, who are some people on TikTok that I should follow? I often do question box with youth. So those are the kind of questions I ask, but it can really be any question you want and just something that's kind of low key, low stakes. I always let everybody know, no names, no identifying information. If someone happens to put identifying information in their question, then I'll just kind of edit it out when I'm reading it. And so again, depending on how much time you have, you can answer questions during the same class or session, or if you know you are going to be with folks over multiple days, then maybe you want to wait till the next session or for a couple of sessions. Are there questions about the question box?
No, not technically about the question box, but we do have a question about questions in general.
Sure.
So someone has mentioned that they found themselves confined by the curriculum and sex ed permission forms in Alberta. So when questions come anonymous or otherwise that do not fit into the curriculum, they're not permitted to answer them. So their question, though it pains, or current practice, though it pains them to do it, is to tell students that there are no bad questions ever, but that they might not be able to answer them all because of the restrictions placed on them by the curriculum and permission forms. Do you think there's a better or additional approach to this issue?
Okay, so that I'm really glad you brought that up because yeah, that can happen sometimes, that you're sort of, if you're working with an agency or you're working with a school or an organization, you may have limitations on how you can answer questions. So I love that you, it sounds like you're letting students know right up front that that's the case. I think that's great. The only other thing that I might suggest, if you are allowed to do that, is if you see a question that you know that you can't answer and you happen to know, say, of a resource, like say, for example, you know there's a book or you've seen a video that does address the question, if you are allowed to offer that resource as an alternative to you answering the question yourself, that is something that you might do. But I actually really like the way that you frame that. You're being honest about the fact that you have boundaries, and they're not your personal boundaries, but yeah, sometimes we also have professional boundaries or limitations. So I think that's fantastic, actually. And if we have time at the end, I know we're like we only have half an hour left. I do have some question box questions that I've been asked over the years if people want to like practice answering question box questions. Okay, so activities and exercises, and this is where somebody already predicted what I was going to do. But just very quickly, You can plan movement-based activities, desk-based activities, or both. So movement activities, as they sound, are like getting up, moving around the room, moving around the space, maybe interacting with each other, talking. So these can be things like role playing. These can be things like forced choice activities where, you know, one end of the room means, yes, I agree with this. One end of the room is, no, I don't agree with that. You can have them move back and forth. All kinds of different things. One activity that I recently kind of invented that I've really been enjoying, although I haven't gotten to play it since the pandemic, is something called Testicle Ball, where we have essentially a basketball net, but it looks like a scrotum. And then we give our participants like knitted, like literal, like knitted testicles of different sizes, and you have to like try to get them in the net. It's a team sport, and it's really just testicles are different shapes and sizes, but it's super fun. And then desk-based activities, so like, you know, writing, journaling, coloring, you know, and I typically, if I can, like to have a combination of both. It's harder in a digital space, but I like to have a combination of both because I find it makes the lessons more dynamic. It creates a connection between sex ed and fun, which, as I said, pleasure focused. And I find it can also have students feel more comfortable and relaxed. So the sort of movement-based kinetic activities, it's just kind of getting energy out of your body. You know, and again, testicle ball, which is like a ridiculous game, is so much fun. I unfortunately haven't had the chance to play it with adults yet, but I'm dying to, because when I play it with kids and teens, we laugh so much because it's so ridiculous. And then if there's been any tension in the room, it's just like, it's fine. So I really, really definitely like, especially as a lead off activity, like anything that is kind of like high energy, that's like a lot about quick responses, that engenders a lot of laughter and silliness. I actually really like to do that as a lead off activity. And sometimes I like to keep the sort of desk-based or static activities for a little bit later, when folks are feeling a bit more comfortable. That's just what I like to do. But again, it's going to depend on the group and the group dynamic, and the people involved. And so if folks are up for it, sorry, I just want to do a quick activity, which I saw in the chat, someone says they already do. And this is an activity you can do in person, or you can do it in chat, as you'll see. I love the idea of this ball game. Students of many ages also like kepi uppy with an inflated condom. Yeah. Oh, you have another meeting. That's okay. Thank you for being here. So apparently some of you already know this activity. It's a fairly common one. It's a classic in sex ed, but I love it. So whoever's comfortable, of course, step up, step back. I am going to ask you in the chat to like just write down a word you know for vulva, like a slang word. It can be anything you want. Like I'm not here to judge. So whatever. Go for it. Nice, nice. There are so many terrible ones. Amazing. The only reason I'm not reading them out loud is because they're like coming in like fast and hot. And I love this, like you're not holding back. This is amazing. And this is a thing I will also say, you know, in a group of students, I'm just like, do not hold back. It's fine. Like I'm not telling on you. It's fine. You can swear, you can whatever. Don't even worry about spelling. So here I'm seeing it in the chat. This is great. If I was doing it in person, I would usually try to have like a flip chart, or if there was a chalkboard, I would be like furiously writing them down. These are awesome. Okay, so, and now I'm gonna ask you to share the words you know for penis. Dong. So happy that was the first one. I mean, I love that like dick showed up like 7 times in a row. That was amazing. We used to have a list. This is so great. One of my favorites I ever heard was Disco Stick. I love it. Bell end, I've never heard that one. That's the other thing I love about this activity. I always get new slang, like every single time. This is awesome. Okay, this is so good. And as our last prompt, words you hear people use for arm. Arm. For arm, yeah, just like arm. So we have a few. I saw wing twice. Appendage, grabbing sticks. Appendage. Yeah, so there are a few. Limb. But when I do this, when I do this in groups, and I will say it to you, what is the word you usually use when you want to talk about someone's arm? Arm. Yeah. And so those of you who have done this activity before, you will know that this is a great way to just lead into a general conversation about how, we have all of these words for our genitals and the sexual parts of our bodies. And then my follow-up question will usually be like, well, why do you think that is? Why do you think that we have all of these words to talk about one part of our body, but then when it comes to like an arm, like eyes, nose, face, other parts of our bodies, we usually just use the word, like just the regular word. And that usually leads into like a fairly fruitful and interesting conversation about like, oh, okay, well, this definitely feels connected to things like sexual shame, and that like we're not supposed to talk about these parts of our bodies, we're not supposed to talk about sex. And but it's also fun, like it's just a fun lead into that conversation because we get to like, yeah, guilt, shame, religion, absolutely. We get to talk, we just get to like name all kinds of like ridiculous genital words. I inform parents that when you bathe your kids, you use all the body parts to explain where you're wanting to watch next. So use that to say penis or vulva so they know what their body parts are really called. Like, yeah, that's such a good, like simple, basic, early sex ed lesson. I love that you share that with parents. I do too. And it's actually really effective, even though it's such a simple technique. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is group discussion. Correct sexual terminology is so protective for kids on a number of levels, like 100%. So yeah, I do like to have time for group discussion. And for group discussion, depending on how many people are in the group and how long I have with people, I usually plan 5 to 10 open-ended questions. 10 is a lot, I will say. Sometimes even 5 is a lot. Like sometimes I will literally get through one question, and the discussion will go from there. I just like to sort of over prepare because every once in a while I will have groups where they're really shy, or they may not be as accustomed to having conversations about sexuality. So I just like to be prepared. And just to reiterate for folks who may not know, although I'm sure most of you know, an open-ended question is a question that requires more than a yes or no answer. And I actually have, Savannah mentioned off the top, I did a YouTube series, Safe Sex Ed, where I basically developed lesson plans and activities based on all the sex ed modules in Ontario's sex ed curriculum. And I will, I can probably just drop the URL for that in the chat for my YouTube channel. But if you go there and you search hashtag Safe Sex Ed, I have playlists, like I have a playlist of everything, and then I have playlists organized by like grade level. And in each one of those lessons, I have like a few open-ended questions that you can ask depending on what the topic is. And yeah, it's just to give, students or your participants a chance to like, again, share their knowledge, share their perspective, learn from each other. It encourages them, it validates their participation in the class, and you can encourage further thought by sort of asking follow-up questions. So again, this is one of those situations where being flexible can be really helpful. I may have my plan of 5 questions, and then I may ask the first one and the conversation goes in a direction that I was not anticipating. And so then I kind of have to, on the fly, maybe think of different follow-up questions. And I would definitely say that it's a skill. It is something that I can do more easily now than when I first started as a sex educator. You really want to sort of actively listen and try to pick up on, what are the students or participants saying? What are they curious about? What has them excited or engaged? But yeah, group discussion is one of my favorite times. I really, really like hearing what folks have to say. I tend to ask a lot of opinion-based questions, like, what do you think about? So I'm just trying to think of a concrete example. Or I guess if people in the chat, want examples of examples of questions you could ask about a certain topic, feel free to put them in the chat. That might be more helpful. Oh, thank you, Savannah and Jennifer. But I'm trying to think. Okay, so, I've done workshops with youth around, say, things like digital citizenship. So basically, how are we treating other people online, on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I might start off with a question like, do you think it's easier, or why do you think sometimes it's easier to say things to people online as opposed to in real life? That might be a question that I might ask. Do you leave them with the F/U questions to take away or to answer in the moment? Oh, sorry, can you just let me know what F/U means?
The follow-up questions.
The follow-up questions. Oh, okay. I usually try to answer in the moment in a group discussion. Again, say if we like run out of time and I know I'm coming back to them another day, then sometimes I might give them the follow-up questions to think about. Like if I'm doing it as an assignment, I might be like, hey, here's a question to think about, and we'll talk about it next time. But it depends on the structure of what I'm doing, definitely. That was a good question. Okay, so we have like 15 more minutes. And does anybody want to, would anybody like to sort of see an example of like question box questions that I get? And if you don't want to, you are completely, you can completely say no or say yes, please. Okay. Great. Okay, so yeah, I can show you the questions and I'll go through a few of them. And also, would it be helpful if I gave you an example of how I might answer some of those questions? Yes, okay. So just a heads up, I kind of have a range of questions from and they come from students and participants of different ages. And I never write down how old people are, and some of these are old, so I may not know how old everybody was here. But yeah, let me just collapse this and go to my other slides. Alrighty, so I think they're here. Yes, okay. Okay, so this is a question I get fairly frequently. Where is the G-spot? And so I would answer this question in a fairly straightforward manner. I would say, okay, well, the G-spot is just kind of like a little area of spongy erectile tissue on the front wall of the vagina. And if you yourself have a vagina and you wanted to kind of feel it, you could put a finger up inside your vagina if that feels comfortable, and then kind of pull your fingers forward, so sort of towards where your belly button is, and feel around. And if you feel sort of like more rough, like, or more textured skin that's sensitive to touch, that is probably your G-spot. Do you have tips for working with folks with developmental or cognitive delays? Oh, I love, sorry, I'm gonna go back to the question. The G-spot feels like if you run your tongue along the roof of your mouth. Amazing, yeah. So similar to working with folks in different communities, usually when I work with, and I will be fully transparent, I haven't done a lot of work yet with folks with developmental or cognitive delays. That's something that is fairly new for me in my practice, so I'm learning a lot. Again, I almost always work with, or actually I have always so far worked with somebody who either has a lot of education and experience working and teaching people with cognitive delays, just because I don't have a lot of training or expertise in that area yet. Can you answer your other questions first? Oh, are there questions that I have not answered yet? Yes. If there are, I will do that. Because yeah, I want to answer y'all's questions first.
Sorry, I guess, yeah, if we want to do a question period, or if you can clarify in the chat, did you mean the other question box questions?
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. That's so generous. Okay, so here's my question I got. How do gay people have babies? And so my answer to this question, and again, I don't remember how old the person was who asked this, but I remember it was somebody younger. So I said there were a few ways. So I said one thing that is important to remember is that when we know, just because we know someone's gender, it doesn't mean that we know what kind of genitals they have. So there are people who are gay who have the type of genitals where they can make a baby biologically, you know, in the same way that some straight people might make a baby biologically. But I'm like, if two people can't make a baby biologically by having penis and vagina sex, then other ways that gay people can have babies is they might choose to adopt a baby. They might choose to have somebody else either donate an egg from their ovaries, or they might have somebody else choose to donate sperm from their testicles, and you know, they may create a baby that way. And so I would usually give, just because we're pressed for time, I would usually maybe give a little bit of a longer answer and ask if people, you know what things like surrogacy are, or what things like in vitro fertilization are. And if they didn't know, then we might talk about that a little bit. But basically, we were talking about how there are actually a lot of different ways to become parents and to bring a baby into your life. What does boner mean? I get this question a lot too. And so I will say, well, a boner is another word for an erection. And this is one of my favorite fun facts to slip in. I'm like, actually, people with penises and people with clitorises can get erections. And inside the penis and inside the clitoris is like this spongy tissue. And when sometimes what will happen if we find something sexually exciting or even just sexually interesting, blood will flow into that spongy tissue and it will fill up, and it will fill up so much that it will feel like the penis or the clitoris is really hard, and it actually feels like there's a bone in there. There isn't, but because it's so hard and stiff, that's where we get the nickname boner. So I'll say, yeah, people with penises and people with clitorises can get boners. My grandma asked me this question years ago, how do gay people have babies? I feel like a lot of people's grandparents have asked that question. Why are there so many genders now? So I would ask this question by saying, actually, there have always been people of different genders, and gender has always been a really diverse experience. And in fact, in like cultures other than our own and throughout history, there are a lot of people who, acknowledged other genders, and they had a lot of different words for gender. And, some people who identified in ways other than, male or female or man or woman or girl and boy were considered to be, really special. They were revered. So there have always been people with a lot of genders, but because in our culture for a long time, people who did not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth were persecuted, and they were made to feel badly, and they were told that that wasn't normal and that that wasn't okay. One of the ways that we did that is that we just didn't create words for people who didn't experience gender in those ways. And now, a lot of those people for a long time have sort of been fighting, and they've been demanding that they deserve to be heard and seen and respected, and they deserve to be called, they deserve to be named, and they deserve to have names for their genders that reflect who they are. And finally, we're listening to them. The gender binary is a colonial idea. Hells yes. And that is something that you could say to somebody like particularly older, and not because I'm like anti talking to kids about colonialism. It's just sometimes they don't have that context, but yes. I'd also like to add that there are lots of different sexes. Yes, we just can't usually see them. And now with advanced bio and genetic testing and internal imaging, we can see there are dozens and dozens. So something that I will often do, even with young kids, is when we talk about biology and anatomy, we will also talk about intersex folks. And I'll just show you because I love showing this at any opportunity. I have like little genital models that are like intersex or, non-binary genitalia, which I love. And the kids think it's so dope. And I think it's dope too. How do you respond to the question, how many genders are there? My answer is usually approximately 7 billion because everyone experiences gender differently. I love that answer. Yeah. So I will usually say something similar. I usually don't give a number, but I'm like, a lot. We don't know the specific number. And something that I will often, like advice I will often give to people, kids and adults, is, whatever, we don't really need to think about how many specific genders there are. It's just when we meet someone and they tell us about their gender and they tell us their name and they tell us what their pronouns are, just believe them. And just, if they ask you to use a certain word to refer to their gender, just use that word. And then it's really easy. But 7 billion is awesome. And you are 100% right, because we all do experience gender slightly differently. Love it. And this will be my last one, and then I'll take general questions. Can a man get pregnant? And so again, this is a great opportunity to talk about the fact that different people can have different genitals and they can have different sexual organs. And so I will say, well, if a man has ovaries and a uterus, yes, a man can get pregnant. And all right, and I've got lots and lots and lots more. I love question box. And I have sometimes done workshops and done classes that are literally just question box, and they are some of my favorites. I never know what questions I'm going to get. I never know where the conversation is going to go, but I have had sessions, particularly with teenagers, where we will spend literally 2 hours just asking and answering question box questions, and it's so fun. And then if we have time left at the end, we'll play like Testicle Ball, or at least that's my plan when the pandemic is over. Yeah, so we still have like 5 more minutes, so I would love and be happy to answer any other questions.
Perfect. So our first question, often I find sexual education is focused on pregnancy and STI prevention, or at least that was their experience. How do you incorporate conversations about pleasure with students?
I'm sorry, can you ask the first part of that question again? I just missed it.
Oh, just that education often focuses on pregnancy and STI prevention.
Yes. So I try to incorporate pleasure wherever I feel it's relevant. So even with something like, say, pregnancy and STI prevention. So let's say we're talking about how to use a condom or how to use a dental dam. One of the things that I will talk about when I am demonstrating or we're doing a lesson on how to use a condom is I will incorporate lube, and I will talk about how, hey, lube is a product that's available to you, and you may have a condom that's already lubricated, or you may want to add some, and that's a thing that a lot of people like to do because it actually can feel really good when you're using a condom. One of my favorite tips that I got from another sex educator, I was like, you can definitely put it on the outside, especially if you're having anal sex. I was like, that's a safer sex tip because you don't want your condoms to tear, but also it's going to make things slipperier and feel better. But also, if you are concerned, if you have a penis and you're concerned about sensation, it's like something you can do is you can also put a little bit of lube on the inside of your condom, because that can really enhance the sensation for the person who has the penis if you are wearing the condom. So I look for places to incorporate information about pleasure, regardless of what we're talking about. If we're talking about anatomy, for example, I will talk about, especially genitals, I will talk about sort of the look and the function of different aspects of anatomy, but I will also talk about, how parts of our anatomy can feel good when we touch them or stimulate them in certain ways, and how, that's a very common thing to want to do if that's a thing that you want to do. So yeah, I try to bring it in wherever it's possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. I teach the parent group of a program for children who struggle with emotional regulation. Many of our youth in the 10 to 13 age group are identifying as trans or non-binary, and their parents are either utterly clueless or in denial. What is the best way to broach this topic without outing a youth while planting seeds of acceptance in their parents?
PFLAG is a fantastic organization. And can I just ask as a follow-up question, are you often sort of talking to or teaching the parents at the same time and in the same space as youth, or do you have an opportunity to sort of work with the parents or talk to them separately? We're in separate rooms. Okay, I love that. So I think one thing that you might try is asking them, in a very gentle, non-judgmental way, what are your concerns? Like, what are you most concerned about in terms of your child? Because it's interesting, I was talking to a colleague about this yesterday, and they gave me such great advice. Because as educators, I think it's really important and really valuable when we can meet people at where they're at. And oftentimes, parents and caregivers will have a lot of confusion, and underlying that confusion is sort of fear and worry. They're just like, I don't know if my kid is going to be okay. And I don't know what this means for them. And so I find sometimes just being able to give them that space to sort of articulate, like, I'm worried because my child is not who I assumed my child to be, and now I don't know what to do with this information. And so sometimes just asking them, like, yeah, is there something specific that you're concerned about? And letting them talk about that. And then I think, yeah, what can happen when you do that is, as they talk and open up, you can get a better sense of, like, what are their specific worries? Because oftentimes it isn't just, I just don't know what this word means, and if I knew what the word meant, I would be okay. They're worried about their kid. And as educators, and as an educator, you probably have information that can really help allay some of those fears that they have, but you kind of have to get to, like, what is the actual underlying fear. Oh, thank you so much, Julia. I know folks have to go. It's 2:30. So thank you for being here, folks who are taking off. And if there are, I still have a little bit of time before I have to go get my son, so I can answer another couple of questions. But I hope that was a helpful answer. Yeah.
All right, our next question, what are your thoughts on having separate education sessions for different genders? I want to promote comfort and the same information for all, but many youth express comfort with the people of the same gender in sex ed. Is it better to have one class or one session for everyone, or one for women, one for men, or one for inclusion in all genders?
So generally speaking, I like to have a cohesive session with all genders, with a lot of and just do a lot of container building. Like if I know I'm in a group of people where I'm like, ooh, okay, like I know, for example, like there's a group of girls and they would rather it just be girls, then I just want to do a lot of container building and really sort of encourage them to speak up about what they need in order to feel more comfortable. And then I try to be very conscientious about enforcing those group agreements for a couple of reasons. Number one, we've been having a lot of great conversations about gender and gender diversity and gender spectrum. And when you divide based on gender, even doing like girls and boys, even if you let people sort of self-identify, it's not going to serve everybody. So yeah, if you have like I'm like, then where do the kids who are non-binary go? Where do the kids go who may like have gotten to the point, or it may not be kids, it may be adults. Where do the people go who, know internally, hey, I know that I know my gender, but external, like I haven't come out, and externally I have been identified as this other gender, but I don't relate to like any of this information. I also do think that there is value in learning to relate to and hold space for people with different perspectives and who move through the world with different identities. And so, for example, as someone who is a woman and was once a girl, I'm like, I 100% understand why, like as a girl, sometimes I was like, oh my gosh, like a lot of boys that I knew at the time, like, especially when I was younger, I'm like, have this sense of entitlement. And I sometimes like, they don't seem super considerate of my feelings, and I don't like that. And it's intimidating. But I think, yeah, there can be value in having a space if you have a facilitator who can be like, I am going to facilitate, for example, people who feel less comfortable because of their gender speaking up. And I am also going to facilitate and encourage people who may feel more entitled to speak up and more entitled to take up space, to learn how to be more considerate, and give a little bit of deference and space to other people. So I think there can be important learning in a mixed gender dynamic. That having been said, I'm not saying that that's the absolute right way to approach it. That's just the way that I tend to approach it.
Thank you so much. We do still have a few questions, but I'm cognizant of the time here. I think we should maybe wrap it up. Nadine, I was wondering if you would be interested in answering any of these questions that I can share in a follow-up email.
Yeah, absolutely, I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, then, thank you so much for joining us today to share all of your knowledge and your experience. This was incredible, and we always love having you here. It's perfect. The chat has been so busy and so positive, and that's really something amazing to see. So thank you everybody for attending today. I just want to remind you that when you close this window, you will be directed to an evaluation survey. So if you can complete that quickly, it really helps us determine what we include and what we focus on in future trainings, resources, and other learning opportunities. I would also like to take this opportunity to share that the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute has created a new webpage called Sexual Health Information for Educators, which includes downloadable documents that connect the Saskatchewan curriculum to important sexual health topics and helpful resources. So I will share that link in the follow-up email as well. And I really hope everyone has a great day. This has been really fun. Thank you so much for joining us again. That was
Oh, it was
so good.
my absolute pleasure. And just wishing everyone a great day and good health, especially nowadays. I hope anyone who is wanting to get vaccinated gets vaccinated really soon. And that, yeah, everyone just stays safe and healthy and happy out there. And it was just such a pleasure being here.
It's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
All right, take care. Bye.